Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 205 of Humanity Rising. It's a beautiful day here in California. Spring is in the air. You'll note the beautiful orchids behind me. Flowers are blooming all over the hillsides, and I'm sure wherever you are, it is springtime, or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the gathering of fall as we approach the equinox. They're the spring equinox, when the light and the shadow dimensions become for an instant equally balanced with the rising of the light in the north and the rising of the shadow in the south. So welcome. Let us begin our session today with a gathering of our hearts together in the spirit of spring. Let us become conscious of our bodies. We are earth. We are nature. We are bodies. And let us close our eyes and put our attention on our hearts. See if you can listen to your heartbeat for just a minute or two. With deep gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive, that we're alive at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to begin by just noting and thanking the very profound and moving and heartful session we had yesterday on the issue of how do we move beyond racism. We did so at a time when we were commemorating the first anniversary of the shooting of Breonna Taylor in her bed as police officers burst into her apartment without knocking and killed her in her bed. We also took note of the fact that the trial of Chovin, the white police officer who put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, who was killed last May. His trial has begun last week. They're in the middle of jury selection, and there is a deep anticipation and alertness, not only around the United States, but around the world, as to whether and how justice will be conducted and executed for this crime. One of the deep points that was made was that racism is global. You see it in virtually every country around the world. It's more acute in some countries than others, but it is a global phenomenon. It seems to be something that we humans need to very deeply consider and move, as the panel noted, to the deepest levels of our consciousness and our spirituality, to grapple with the issues of race and how we can embrace the most obvious fact in the world, that we are one, and that it is our diversity that unites us. We're all the colors of the rainbow. We're every conceivable culture and language. And if we could harness all that diversity within the spirit of love and appreciation, just imagine the creativity that would burst forth like the springtime. And it's in this spirit that I want to open our session today, which is a birthday celebration of Stan Grof, who's probably done as much as anybody to unpack and unfold and illuminate our understanding of consciousness. And not only our personal consciousness, but our collective unconsciousness and our transpersonal consciousness. How we are united, how all of life is conscious. He is in his 90th year. He's going to be celebrating his 90th birthday on July 1. And because many of us love him so dearly, we wanted to just begin starting in January with Susan Hess-Loger, who has done a beautiful documentary called Voyage of the Psychonaut about Stan's life. We wanted to just gather month by month individuals who have known him and been inspired by him. So today we're going to hear from Jack Kornfeld. Many of you know he's one of the great Buddhist teachers of our contemporary time. He's the founder of Spirit Rock. And he has worked with Stan combining Vipassana meditation, the original teaching of the Buddha, with the holotropic breath work that Stan and a number of others created for a psychological and emotional process of breakdown and breakthrough into higher levels of spiritual refinement. You remember back to the Buddha, his first teaching. If you want to get enlightenment, follow your breath. Follow your breath. And Stan did that as Jack has done that. And it's a beautiful blending of the most ancient wisdom with the most modern wisdom. We're going to hear from Mary Mangini as a young woman meeting Stan at Esalen and becoming familiar with his very deep work on the birth process. Him pointing out that in utero, we're shaped as if not more profoundly than we are after we're born. And on the inspiration of that, she became a midwife and has been a dean at a college of nursing, teaching midwifery for many, many years, and working in the psychedelic therapeutic domain, particularly around the issue of addiction. And then we're going to hear from Paul Groff, Stan's brother, who, like Stan, was a medical doctor, but he went into the chemical biological route, which you're all familiar with, of modern medicine and modern science, even as Stan went into the psychological and the psychoactive and psychodynamics of the psyche. And the extraordinary thing, these two brothers have both been great scientists in their own right. one starting from the outside in, the other one from the inside out, and they've met together in an agreement that in the end, it is consciousness that unites everything as one. So I'd like to, with great affection and deep respect, introduce Susan now, who will commence our program. Susan?
Contributions with as many people as possible, and to invite today some amazing people that have been with him on that journey. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce Stan and Brigitte, and Stan Grof and his wife, Brigitte Groff, who have been amazing partners in this journey. And I'm waiting for them to join us. There we go.
It takes a little.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. Before I start anything else, I would like to say something important, which is that 2.5 years ago, I had a stroke. I didn't have any kind of paralysis, but it mostly hit my speech center. So I would like to introduce my sweetheart, my wife, Brigitte. We have known each other over 30 years, about 35 years. Mm-hmm. But we have a reunion 6 years ago, and we got married almost 5 years ago. Yeah. Yes. So she will be here, and if I have some problems with speeches, she would help us. She basically knows everything that I would be talking about, and she will help. Do you want to say something yourself?
No, I'm very happy to be here with everybody. Such a pleasure to get together, and yeah, I'm happy to help you anytime.
We probably will talk about SLN today, so maybe yes. You can say that.
Yes.
You have been there for
35 years ago,
yeah.
So I know everybody from then.
And you have done so many workshops.
Yes.
Long workshops, transport workshops, and you basically starting with holotropic breathwork before anybody else was having training.
Yes, I'm a holotropic dinosaur, I call myself.
You are the youngest, but they call it a dinosaur. Dinosaur. Holotropic breathwork. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
So thank you very much, Susan. And this is a wonderful reunion, and thanks you what you all guys are doing. It's amazing.
Well, yes, especially since today we have Jack Kornfeld, Maria Vittoria Mangini, and your brother Paul Groff joining us today. And so we're going to show a brief clip from the documentary of Jack. We interviewed Jack in the process of making the documentary. He was one of the first people that we interviewed. And in the documentary, he tells an amazing story from the many workshops that they co-taught. And this is a moment from the full-length interview.
Well, we've collaborated for 35 years, but over certainly a 25-year period. And people found that the meditation gave them tools to focus. The meditation gave them tools to center themselves and have the capacity to go in these extraordinary realms with some equanimity and some compassion. And it also, the meditation gave them a way of integrating the great openings that come from the breath work. And the meditations and trainings gave them a way of carrying that forward when they went home. So the deep transformative work of the holotropic breathwork practices were held by and integrated through the meditative trainings, and those were a great fit.
Welcome, Jack.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you for all that good work, and wonderful to see everybody, to see you, Stan and Brigitte, and to see Maria and Paul. I'm just happy to talk about this work and Stan and what I've learned and what we've shared together over these past decades. I first met Stan back in the early mid-70s when I was still a graduate student in psychology and also beginning to teach at the first Naropa Buddhist University. And I heard about your work, Stan, and then invited you to come teach at a center that I was helping run. I met you and Joan, and you were just leaving Spring Grove for Esalen. And I remember seeing these 1-inch reel-to-reel videos that you had of the LSD sessions that you gave to people with terminal cancer and other folks that were in your study. And I remember especially the one of Jesse, who was the coal miner in West Virginia. And Jesse had gone through, a terrible cancer. He was an older guy and his body was all shrunken and he was terrified. He was in a lot of pain and a lot of fear. And then you saw him being held with the eye shades on as he went through his LSD session and music. And he came out and it was as if he was reborn. He said, "My pain is gone." And his face became smooth and clear, but that wasn't the thing. He looked at you and he said, I in his West Virginia accent, he said, I've never thought about this, but I saw God. I'm not afraid to die anymore. I'm at peace. And I saw this, remembering that I'd just come out of some years of training in the Buddhist monastery. And of course, I had taken my share of LSD at Haight-Ashbury and things years before. And I thought, this is a kindred spirit. This is a man who knows this extraordinary territory of birth and death and all the rest of it. And I just want to get to know him and hang out with him. So I went out to Esalen to meet with Stan and at that time Joan and plan a big event that I might talk about a little bit. But I have to say, Stan, that you became not only a colleague and a close friend and a teacher to me and a mentor, but one of the most important people in my entire life. We rarely get to hang out with people who change the whole trajectory of our life and who just on the side happen to be one of the most brilliant genius psychologists, psychiatrists, human development people that you'll ever have the honor to be around. And just to say a little bit, and I'm sorry for embarrassing you, Stan, but he is he's got so many multiple dimensions of accomplishment as a scientist, completely at ease in medicine and hanging out with physicists like David Bohm and, Nobel laureate level, looking at the nature of mind and physics, but also totally interested in shamanism and mythology with Joseph Campbell and systems theory with Gregory Bates. And he attracted and spent time with some of the most brilliant people of the era because of his own synthetic brilliance, being able to look at the nature of consciousness itself and through the work that he did, but more than that, through his own deep understanding, to see the integration of these different dimensions, and on the side to be a polymath who also happened to know all great classical music and speak tons of different languages, and looking whether it's Sanskrit or Italian or Russian and German and English and French and whatever. But the big thing is, a couple of things that I've loved is how much acceptance you have, Stan, of people just as they are. It's like this giant compassionate heart. And we would be working and people would go, because we spent many years doing these paired holotropic breathwork sessions, as I just described in that clip, where people would do the holotropic breathwork and meditate. People would go into the most extraordinary states, which you, Stan, had mapped in a way that no one else prior to you had, certainly in the Western world. and maybe anywhere, because you open the fabric of the perinatal experiences of what it was like to relive the times around birth and during birth and prior to birth and all of that. These amazing maps. And I just marveled at how much compassion and care you brought to everybody who was doing their deep, profound opening, and then help them see it and understand it in a cosmic perspective, which changed people's lives. And somehow you did it with such humor and good, kind of gracious spirit, and with a kind of indomitable equanimity. People would be dying. We'd have hundreds of people breathing, and it was like going into Dante's, Divine Comedy. There would be people dying and going through hellish experiences, and there'd be people going through divine experiences and, melting into God and bliss. And, this great team of facilitators, and people would call you over, and you were just there with each person with a profound acceptance and equanimity and a kind of unstoppable curiosity that was new each time. I'm just going on and on because I love you, and I love you both, and also because I haven't seen anything quite like this in my life. And I remember, you're being with that person who had demonic possession, and even the facilitators, which I'll talk about in a moment, that you had trained, were sort of backing away, slashing, I'll kill you, I'll tear you apart. And Stan sits down, and instead of being either reactive or frightened or worried or something, he just starts a little dialogue with the demon. And he says, who are you? And they, what do you mean, I'm a demon? I don't tear your face off. And he says, you don't know who you are. You have no idea who you really are. And the demon goes, what? And he starts to kind of unwind the consciousness of this demon until it's kind of confused. And then it starts to go back toward a kind of integration where the person who is breathing and possessed by this begins to realize, oh, this is a state of consciousness that's come. And it just happened over and over again, in loving ways, in difficult ways, with an incredible kind of mastery. What was also fun is that we got to travel all around the world and do this. And you think, that some of these Western psychology is so often done in a culture-specific way that fits Americans or, Europeans, British or whatever. But we did it many places around the world, and it didn't matter your culture, your background. When you did this deep breath holotropic process, which I have to say in parentheses was there because it wasn't legal to give psychedelics to people. We all know this. In fact, people on occasions around that would take psychedelics, even though they were instructed not to. But you wanted to find a way for people to open and discover the cosmic nature of their own consciousness, the great heart of compassion, the fact that they contained and were everything, and that it wasn't someplace far away, or they didn't have to go to a temple in the Himalayas or a shaman in the Amazon, but that actually it lay inside of them. That's who they really are. And your mapping and confidence worked in all of these cultures. It was extraordinary. Yeah, I'm just going to take a pause. How does all this sound to you, Stan, to hear all of this?
Jack, I'm just sorry that I'm the most articulate today as I used to be, and I would like to be. But you are just somebody whom I just love, and you have been probably more than anybody else through our life. All the different things that happened, weddings and death and so on, and you were always there, and I just love you.
Yeah, weddings and divorces even. We had a very deep connection through all of the many life cycles that we all shared. We shared together because you did with me as well.
Brigitte got into it so wonderfully, into it.
Yeah. I mean, the other things to say, just to follow on the theme, one of the many extraordinary things that you did, that you had done, was to create the training, the holotropic breathwork training, and train, I don't know how many facilitators or more, thousands. And I've worked with people around the world now, both meditation masters and in the psychotherapy world of great trainers and all the things from the early years of transpersonal psychology that you helped to found and that I became a part of. And the result of the training was a cadre of people who were comfortable sitting and being present for the breadth of human experience that I've almost never seen anywhere else. And I so trust them. They become so trustworthy because they could sit with birth and past life experiences and trauma and, wartime memories and incredible tenderness and dissolving into, ecstasy. And they could be with it all. Not only could they be with it and hold that as you had taught them, because they really learned this from you, but they were willing to do it as long as it took. That part of the process that you opened was that as people were experiencing the profound opening of body and heart and consciousness, it had its own arc. And especially if it was tied in knots in different ways internally, it took a long time for some people to resolve through that. And your work was always to have them go through it and not back away or put it on the side, but say, if you go through the center of this, something new will be born. And the facilitators would sit with people all night, all day, however long it took. We're there for you in a way that was both an extraordinary dedication, which was part of yours. And I think of long nights in the desert in Yucca Valley where we'd been doing, hundreds of people in breathwork. And there would be a certain group of people who'd gone into the most profound realms of whether it was their past trauma or past lives or going into other states, and were trying to navigate their way back. And we would be in that room and there would still be music playing, and it would be night and dark for hours and hours and hours, and the sun would come up. And the sun would come up, and often there was still this small group of people who'd gone through really what was a death rebirth experience that happened often or commonly in this profound work. And like Jesse that I described, somehow they were born anew on this earth, and it changed them in a way that really transformed their lives. Now, the fact that you would teach this and do this, and we did this together for all those time, in the middle of a very difficult and turbulent global era, many of them, including now that we're in, and relate and link them together, knowing that the solution for the world, what's needed, is not more technology, not artificial intelligence and nanotechnology and biotechnology. No amount of technology and human outer devices and all of our outer development are going to stop continuing warfare, are going to stop continuing racism and continuing, tribalism and continuing climate change and all the terrible things that we have to solve. And you knew from the beginning that it required, that all these are born in the human heart, all these problems, and that it required a shift of consciousness so that the programs that we did and that you put together, which brought scientists and ecologists and Zen masters, all that together, were as much inner as outer. There wasn't a division between the two. And I remember our Buddhism in the Mind, which was one of our first great dances, 6 weeks with all these great masters, Tartan Tulku and Chogyam Trungpa and Lama Gobinda and, Kusung San Sansanim, the great Korean Zen master. And then there was Mangini, who put on a great black blindfold, and he was a sword master and unsheathed the sword and ran shouting across the grass with completely blindfolded with this student lying with a watermelon on his belly, no shirt, on the grass, and cut the watermelon in half without harming the student, doing a somersault with his sword in his hand, saying "Yeah!" And we're all kind of slack-jawed, going, "Okay, this is something we've never even imagined in our life." Or Zen Master Chovin coming, the most elegant, wonderful Zen master, and teaching Zen archery and setting up this beautiful target and taking a long time to put on the most elegant robes and every arrow out and doing it like a ballet, and finally drawing the bow back, and we're all completely entranced. And in the last moment, he lifted the bow up and let the arrow fly over the target and into the ocean. And then he smiled, took a bow, and did the whole ballet of unwinding it. And it was such a gorgeous teaching that the target, that the whole game is not that. I mean, that has its own good place, I must say, and other things, but it's not just that. But in fact, it's the dance that we're in together that shows this kind of greater beauty and harmony. And you've written about it in so many ways, but especially my favorite book is still The Cosmic Game. It's this great spiritual text that describes, from all that you learn, what the nature of consciousness is. So, yes, I'll stop here for a second. See what else you want to add.
Thank you so much. We were just, you were talking about these things that we were doing together, Vipassana and breathwork. Those were my favorite. And we have been talking recently, Brigitte and myself, that this is the way it should be done. The way you were sort of bringing in medication after the breath work, instead of going and talking, in the sharing, we were doing first medication, so people could really properly integrate the session. And then at the very end, people were talking about it, and everything was being done with license during breakfast and evening.
With silence.
With silence. Everything was in silence. It's done at a ashram. This was a very perfect context, much better than we had in other places.
Well, we made it like a temple.
Hotels all over the world. This was really done the way it should be done. And
yeah, the work that's so deep, it's sacred work, and we made it like a temple in which that sacred work could be held, sometimes in silence or sometimes coming together in this beautiful way. And the work is so powerful. Yes, it will work in a hotel ballroom or a gymnasium, which we also did. But as you say, it wasn't really the ideal context. And in some way, what people have been learning, our culture is almost defined by the absence of the sacred in our consciousness. And part of the work that you were doing was inviting people to come back into a relationship with the nature of consciousness itself, of who we are in the deepest way, and of the sacredness of life, of their own bodies and hearts.
And so Wes was great also, in this, and the guys of you were always ended up on the floor, and we were doing breath work yourselves.
Yes.
Which was great, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Why, I wouldn't want to miss out. It was all so good. Yeah. And
I know, all your month-longs, all your ITA, you have just done amazing things there.
Yeah, we had a wonderful time in the mountains in Switzerland. Remember, we did one retreat in a valley where they spoke Romansh, which is one of the last kind of surviving Latin-like languages in the far reaches of Switzerland, near the Engadine. And there we were high in the mountains, so people were already in this amazing state. And then we did the breath work. And again, as a kind of sacred temple, people were then invited to go out and walk in these extraordinary vistas of Swiss alpine flower-covered meadows. And the image of, hippie flower children in California, this was like a whole nother level up. It was fabulous.
And Hidden Mountain was good. She was at the beginning of the 6 month long or 6 weekend. It was on Buddhism. We'd say Buddhism and what was the name?
Buddhism and mind.
You were Hidden
So
Mountain.
you were, you came there with all your food. We didn't
That's
get
right.
it from SLN. She was doing all the eats there. Wonderful, very special kinds of for Hindu and for
And do you remember that we
the
cooked our
Buddhas.
way through the Dali cookbook? We cooked all the recipes in Le Dîner de Gala.
Oh yeah.
Strawberry.
This was a major beginning here for you, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
And Jack also. This was the beginning at Esalen. It's
Yes.
one of many. Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in and clarify that Maria Vittoria Mangini also goes by Hidden Mountain. So that might have thrown people off, but so shall we call you Hidden Mountain in the course of our conversation?
Oh, I think it's more natural for me and Stan, I think, but maybe I should tell the story about how it came to be that I was called that.
Well, before you do that,
How it started, that would be
let's
great.
let's play the little tape of your interview, and then after the interview, you just jump in. Love to hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
When I encountered Stan Groff and his work, he had just completed the first book in which he describes the perinatal matrices, and he I think was persuaded, and he certainly persuaded me, that the biologic experience of birth has the potential to create for both the woman giving birth and the person being born a kind of template, which is a pathway for all kinds of transformative experiences that might then happen in the life of that individual subsequent to that birth.
Well, that's an excellent choice, because we were talking about the Buddhism and Mind workshop, but the occasion on which my name got changed was actually before that. And I think the subject of the work that we were doing was hallucinogens and shamanism. And we had put a lot of emphasis on the wild areas around Big Sur, and people were being really encouraged to go out there. And there was a kind of workshop leader or wilderness leader who would go through our packs and make sure we weren't taking any powdered eggs or paperback novels, so that we would really experience the wilderness undiluted by trappings of civilization. And I took the occasion of a full moon, when there was a full moon eclipse, to climb up onto Partington Ridge to see what kinds of experience I would have if I spent that moonlit night up there. And it took me a whole day to get up there because I wasn't really in very good shape, and I was going very, very slowly. And I wasn't taking anything with me because I was kind of going by the dictates of the wilderness leader. But I got up there, and it was a very moving place to be in, especially in the moonlight and in the eclipse. And I had this sense that the native people whose place that was had only left there moments ago, and that their experience of the place and the plants that they valued and the paths that they used and the tools that they made were all right there with me. And I began a conversation with one of those people who was someone from that place. And I had this talk with her, and actually Hidden Mountain turned out to be her name.
And she wanted to make a deal with me because she was from the place that was around the hot springs and had a tremendous regard for and value for the hot springs. But she had left the body before she had had enough time to take enough baths. So my assignment from her was I was supposed to take a lot of baths, and that then she would share with me some things that I mightn't otherwise have known. And Hidden Mountain was actually her name. And I was so excited by this. And when the sun came up, I came barreling down the ridge, and it was a lot easier to get down than it was to get up. And so I got to the lodge at Esalen just as breakfast was being served, and I was dying to tell somebody this story. And Stan was there having breakfast with a very stately older gentleman whom I didn't know. But I went and I sat down at their table, and as soon as I could engage them, I started telling him about how I had had this experience. And I was blessed with this contact with this individual. And the punchline for me was, and I want to be a shaman. And they both looked at me, and they had this look of utter compassion and understanding. But then the older gentleman said, well, you can't. And I almost burst into tears. And I said, why not? And Stan said, because there's no job description for that in the culture that you're currently living in. And so that became for me a kind of stepping off point in which I tried to find a way of being in the world that I actually did inhabit that would allow for the kinds of magical healing and access to dimensional consciousness that I knew was possible, but for which there really wasn't a very good job description in my world and culture. And because I think primarily because of Stan's understanding of the perinatal experience, I settled on midwifery. I had a little encouragement to do that from Gregory Bateson, who also kind of pointed me in that direction. But I eventually left Esalen around 1980 and went into nursing. I went into nursing at the master's level because I wanted to be a midwife. And I went back to graduate school, and for the next 5 years I was in school learning how to be a midwife to use the insights that came from Stan's theoretical understanding of the environment of birth to try to make what I thought was political and social change. He had held that the template that's created for people in their actual birth experience becomes a kind of outlook for them for other kinds of transformative things that happen to them in their lives. And the insight that comes from that is that if you can encourage people to move in a gentle and accepting way through those kinds of transformative episodes, that you can change the world because you'll change the way that people see the world. And I was born in 1950. I grew up in the Haight-Ashbury era in the 1960s. I had a lot of opportunity to get involved with a lot of political activity, and I really saw myself as primarily an agent for social change. And it really seemed like that was a really good place to put my energy, where I would get a lot of movement for a relatively small investment. And that's what I did. I became a midwife, and I have practiced as a midwife since 1985. I became a specialist in the care of women. But the interesting thing that has happened to me in relation to that recently is that, I have an abiding affection for psychedelics because of my adolescence, which was in the Haight-Ashbury, and the really important and transformative experiences that I had there. But I always really kept that quiet, particularly in my professional life. It was like Hidden Mountain was in a different room, and Maria Mangini, the midwife, was somewhere else. But what I've noticed is that the skills and practices that midwives use in attending births are similar to the skills and practices that people use in attending people at the end of life, and similar to the skills and practices that we now try to teach people to use in attending people in alternative realities and unusual states of consciousness, whether with breath work or now as the reputation of psychedelics in the society has begun to be reconsidered. There's a lot of imperative to train people to be able to be present for people in those experiences, using exactly those same kinds of skills and practices, not to let someone else's anxiety become your anxiety. recognition that the process has a kind of internal natural map, which if it's allowed to unfold in a safe and spontaneous way, will carry people through the process without the need for a lot of intervention. And these are things that midwives know, people who attend people at the end of life know, and now the greater population of people who are learning once again to be psychedelic guides and therapists also know. And all of these things Stan had the insight to recognize very, very early in the process, really before any of these things were generally acknowledged by a lot of other people. So I'm very grateful. I actually, one of the things I did as a nurse midwife was I became a teacher of nurses and nurse practitioners. And I was the director of a master's degree program for nurse practitioners for about 20 years. And I recognized as I began to see that I had a career in teaching that I would have to get a Ph.D. if I wanted to progress. So I did actually go to doctoral study at the University of California. But once again, something that I learned from Stan was the expression Sitzfleisch, which I think means sitting flesh. I mean, actually, I think it literally means having a big bottom. But it's what it takes to stay in your chair when you have a big project that, you know, sometimes has some really maybe boring, maybe strenuous, maybe difficult aspects to it. And I started to think about what would I have the Sitzfleisch to really accomplish in a doctoral program. And really the thing that I cared enough about to do that was psychedelics. So I challenged the Department of Nursing, the School of Nursing at the University of California, to discover whether they would allow me to write about psychedelics and the psychedelic experience as a doctoral study. And in fact, nursing is a very spacious territory, and I was able to constitute a committee that would supervise that work. And I did a doctoral interview study of people who, at the time that I encountered them, they were 40 years old or older, about what the impact of their experiences with psychedelics had been in the lives that they had led. And people told me heart-stoppingly intimate things about how they had become better parents, they had turned into more reliable employees, they had recognized their responsibility for the stewardship of the natural environment, they had gone into an organic farming, they had become able to regard their estranged relatives with compassion. All sorts of amazing transformative personal changes that had come about to people in their unsupervised self-experimentation with psychedelics, because this was in the era when none of this was permitted. And the use of chemicals to alter consciousness was considered to be a completely criminal act. But nevertheless, people had pursued these substances and had these experiences. And I ended up writing a doctoral dissertation, the title of which is, Yes, Mom Took Acid, that's about people's experiences with psychedelics and how they changed their lives. And all of this I was empowered to do, I think, because when I was, how old was I when I encountered you, Stan? Maybe 23 or 4. And I asked you one time, I actually got to do some supportive work for some of the workshops that were going on at Esalen. And as I said, I cooked a lot of meals and I did a lot of other kinds of whimsical things. But I asked one time, how did I find myself in this situation where I was allowed to have this kind of access and experience? And Stan said, well, your chin was quivering. And I knew that just a little bit of encouragement and you would go through a really profoundly transformative period in your life. And boy, was that ever right. And I also got to participate in a lot of really amazing and wonderful whimsy. Jack is talking about the project that we did when I was working there as an administrative person, fluffing people's pillows and picking them up at the airport and scrambling their special eggs in the morning. But I also got a few other points of access granted to me. Chogyam Trungpa came and brought his entourage to participate in that workshop. And I got what would in rock and roll be called the riders from the Trungpa outfit, so, you know, the grocery list of what brand of sake and how many lamb chops and like that we had to have in stock so that we could serve him. And in the middle of the night, someone from his group got me up and said, well, Trungpa wants a peach daiquiri.
And I got up and made him a peach daiquiri because I was the kitchen. And I served the peach daiquiri, and he said, you're going to get a good birth in your next lifetime because you make a mean peach daiquiri. So not everything that we did there was real serious. Do you remember, Stan, that we had Ajari Pemshikov Warwick come with the Montreux Sun Mountain Band and dig a big hole in the lawn between the Dick Price's house and the White House and do a Hewatari and a Saito Goma ceremony where people walked on the coals of fire and the sacred bonfire was built. You remember that?
I remember just 2 people were burned, and a lot of people not.
A lot of people were not burned. And Dick Price woke up the next morning and there was a big hole in the lawn between his house and the White House. And he said, who let those people in? And unfortunately, it was me. So, but it was, this was profoundly fun and quite whimsical. And so.
Great memories, yeah. I wanted to tell you that how a special friend you are. That we started doing biography. You get some money, or you were promised some money, and we were doing it for quite a while. And you were on all those Essel and in all those month-longs and so on. So I always says, okay, now this will be like official biography, and this is what is for you. This is going to be open, to 20, 50 years. This will be a secret. This is the secret
the transpersonal
movement,
I do know. And, I'm from a middle-class family, and I've lived kind of a working class life because I elected to become a hippie, and I've lived in a rural collective. And so I never really had a lot of money, and I haven't ever really been able to stop and write a book. And I think that kind of interfered with my progress toward writing a biography of you. But now I'm retired. I'm an emerita professor from the university where I used to be the head of the nursing program. And I'm starting to write a little bit and a little bit more. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to go back to all those notes and recordings that we made, because what a worthwhile and fascinating life to write about. I mean, there's so many wonderful things that we talked about and you told me, and I would so very much like to share them.
I just want that you're the person who knows that.
I do. I know that, and a lot of the more, I know.
Hopefully, it's going to show up sometime in the future.
You have written about some of the more sort of outrageous and whimsical things that happened as a part of our history that we share, but there's so many more. I mean, just the thing that I mentioned about the cookbook and the fact that we made all those very, very fanciful meals for people, or going to Pick Valley and swimming under the waterfall in Pick Valley, where, the bedrock mortars were still visible in the creek and the pestles were still in them, as if the native people had just left there 5 minutes ago. What a magical and wonderful place, which you brought people to and allowed them to see and experience that. Can you tell that I'm grateful?
Thank you so much for everything. Yeah.
You're entirely welcome.
Thank you, Maria. What an extraordinary life you've had. Whoa. Whoa. Still a hippie after all these years.
True that.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Jack, Paul, do you want to make a quick comment, and then we'll move on to Paul's presentation?
Well, I loved hanging out with Hidden Mountain as well. And there is something about this shared collective of holding this work together with Stan. Stan, you made a field in which we all could be ourselves. That was one of the great, and there weren't all these Stan imitators around, which says something, because you were not very interested in focusing on yourself. You're really interested in helping people open, and it felt so similar to the very best of the Zen training. And there would be teachings on death and rebirth and so forth. This was practical death and rebirth. Come and join us and take who you thought you were and open the box. And that's what you're saying, Maria, in some way.
You know, Stan, also
beginning.
in that time, you know, I can mostly speak to the time that I experienced, although I know it's gone on past and beyond that. But Stan's energy is such a vortex that it drew in all these really extraordinary people who wanted to share in the discoveries and the adventures that were happening there. So, you know, the cast of characters, I mean, we just ran through the list of Buddhist teachers who were in just that 1 6-week project, but Gregory Bateson was a regular participant. Joseph Campbell was a regular participant. There were you know, we had teachings from people who had direct experience of traditional cultures and who had been initiated into indigenous wisdom directly. We had visitation from people from cultures who had kept alive practices from time out of mind that now people are
like Don Jose,
Don Jose Matsua,
who is 103, 4 or 5-year-old Huichol Indian shaman that we would never have met without having Stan at the nexus of this.
Michael
leading peyote ceremonies and showing us certain things that came from thousands of years of their culture.
Michael Harner actually, I think, said this as well as anybody, and he was another person who was in his own right an incredible innovator and genius. But, you know, he talked about shamanism as a legitimate religious practice for people in contemporary cultures. And he said, shamanism does not consist in knowing how many bat wings to put in the brew. It consists in being able to be yourself perfectly in front of another person, because that gives that person the permission to be themselves perfectly in front of you. And I think you've just epitomized that, Stan. It's a really amazingly shamanic life. I hesitate a little bit about the use of that term anymore because people are sensitized about it. So I'm starting to say magic healers. So then I would say I would identify you as a magic healer in the great tradition of those people participating to the benefit of their community throughout the history of the human race.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you, Maria.
Hidden Mountain, was it that workshop that you were talking about, where we also had Leo and we had about six Huichol kids?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. And, you know, I
remember they walked into the big house and the kids, then Gordon Wasson came.
Yes.
And there were the 6 Huichol, they were watching Mickey Mouse or something.
An amazing, you know, I didn't mention that was how I met you, was that my teacher and the person whom I used to refer to as my guru, with whom I had a similar relationship where I was like the person who cooked the meals and sewed the curtains and stuff like that, and also participated in the work in whatever way was most useful. He came across you in a seminar for psychologists in Estes Park and brought you back to meet the group of people that he was working with in the Bay Area and in Bulliness. And at the end of that, I said, we knew that Leo was going to go to be in a 6-week workshop with you in Esalen. And I went to Joan, who was at that time organizing all of this stuff, and said, well, I want to go too. And she said, well, that's nice, but there's 27 people on the waiting list in front of you, and the workshop costs $1,500. And I was very disappointed. But I went home, and about 3 days later, the bookstore that I was the manager of gave me a $1,500 bonus. And about a week after that, Joan called me up and she said, well, you know, we try sociometrically to balance these workshops so that there's a lot of different kinds of people in them. And the person who most exactly corresponds to you in age and background has just dropped out. So if you want to come, you can. And that was how I ended up there. So a sort of magical synchronicity at the very beginning.
Great.
Beautiful. Well, let's turn now to Stan's brother, Paul. And
I'm very happy that Hidden Mountain is no more hidden for me. We share, of course, Stan and share a number of friends, but I heard your name and I met you in passing, but I did not connect these two things together. So it's nice, and it's been wonderful stories that you shared.
Paul, you've met me at Stan and Brigitte's wonderful costume parties also.
But not under your name.
Good. Let's transition to Paul now. And Rick, if you'll play that video, and then Paul, you can share your reflections and stories.
Our research and Stan's research really started in completely different ways, almost in the opposite ends. And it's so interesting that now I think we can see, after many years, how they confluence together in terms of covering different aspects of how non-ordinary states of consciousness develop, how they unfold, you know, what's behind the process. Well, I know that Susan wanted me to talk about my research and maybe touch on a little bit on the treatment issues with holotropic breathwork, but I hesitate a bit to get into that. I think it's too serious, and this is a nice, very nice, lighter level. Had I known that, I would have probably prepared some family pictures, and because we had a lot of interesting experiences with also in the early years. And then I came to the States to spend 3 months with you, Stan, with the idea that I then go back and the Iron Curtain will lock again, and that we may not see each other again. And it's just 53 years later, I'm still here. So it's interesting. And we had so many interesting things. I mean, just what things quickly come to mind is when we did the Sierra Nevada horseback riding, or the meetings after Mom's funeral, so meaningful, and your wedding to Brigitte and the celebration afterwards. So many memories. I could have brought some pictures, but I can very briefly summarize the research. Oh, we of course had a number of very interesting experiences in the research institute. That was such an interesting synchronicity that we ended up there together, because we were both unacceptable for academic life. I won some competitions and was always kicked out because of political reasons. And then they opened up this research institute, and there was such an awful accommodation shortage under the communists that would qualify you if you had an accommodation, and you had parents living in Prague. So that's how we ended up in the same institute. And my desire was to become a child psychiatrist, but they set up the unit, lasted only about 2 months, and the director, I think, voted for a wrong new director of the institute, so he was kicked out, and child psychiatry was closed. And so that's how I ended up actually in psychopharmacology, and certainly on a conceptually completely different end than Stan being in the psychotherapeutic department. But these were very interesting 4 years, because in the institute there was a number of people who were politically undesirable, but very good experts in their own field. one memory I have very vivid was you probably don't know this, I don't think it's generally known, that there was a Kurt Freund who was a Jew, survived the war. His wife, who was a Christian, managed to hide him for the whole war, different places. And he survived.
Good Freud, yeah.
Yeah.
Good Freud, yeah.
Yeah, good Freund. Yeah, Kurt Freund. Yeah.
Not Freud, yeah.
Point.
And what you don't know, and what's generally don't know, it's not known, is that he is actually responsible for this freeing of homosexuals. Homosexuality at that time was heavily punishable. You could get 10 to 20 years in prison for homosexual act. And he was very interested in sexual motivation of sexual behavior. And so he developed this phalloplatismography where you attach a condom-like.
With the great slides, yeah.
Right?
With some great slides.
Yes. And so he showed very clearly, initially with men, and then later with women, that the sexual appetite is completely biologically determined to the greatest detail. And so we had, it feels funny now as we're going to be celebrating Stan's 90th birthday, because at that time we were celebrating Kurt Freund's 50th birthday, and it seemed like he's an old, venerable gentleman. And so there were big preparations for celebration.
And an interesting secretary also.
Yeah. Well, you could tell that, but yeah, he had a male secretary, and they could not figure out these unusual results they had with some men. Anyway, that's a different story when they measured them. But this was an interesting one. We had this birthday celebration, and trying to figure out some kind of present gift for Kurt. And Stan used his special artistic talent. And, when you have marzipan dough, you can get it in a variety of colors. It can be red and blue and rosy and all kinds of things. So there's this celebration for Kurt Freund, and Stan brings this big box, opens
the
it.
50th anniversary, yeah.
Yeah, 50th birthday.
Big one, a very big one, yeah.
Opens up box, and there is this, from the marzipan in all possible colors, a beautiful replica of a penis and testicles in living colors. Now, I thought it was about
the cake, yeah.
The cake.
Yeah, about 3 to 4 times of the normal size. Now, that would be my standard. People may have some different ratios for this, but that certainly created a major sensation for I remember number of good stories, but I think I should say something at least about the research, and I can probably summarize the research very, very quickly. Essentially, what is interesting, that coming really from this biological assumption, which really still dominates mainstream psychiatry, that what's underlying emotional problems and psychiatric problems is some biological and neurochemical abnormality in the brain. And working from this hypothesis in all 3 major lines of research in the clinical research programs that I've run, both neurobiological, genetic, and clinical.
Somebody's calling.
That must be the iPad. So all these three lines, the findings very much support Stan's conclusion that the non-ordinary states cannot be generated from the brain. All the findings are incompatible. Maybe I can very quickly take you in 2-3 minutes, just a quick trip through the slides without touching any details. Oh, now I have to share it first. Here we are. Yeah, on the neurobiological side, the interesting point is when you look neurobiologically at the non-ordinary states of consciousness like depression and mania, which are completely opposite. It's in the traditional description, depression would be as good description of hell as you can have it, and mania, when people experience it, they crave it. It's as close to heaven. And yet, when we study it over 35 years, all I'm going to show that for both, yes, there are, as the mainstream psychiatry assumes, there are biological changes in large number. Before we studied about 35 different indicators, but they are all in the same direction for both these opposite states. So it's really not compatible with these states being generated in the brain. And similarly, you can see, for example, if you induce the non-ordinary states artificially, for example, with psilocybin, you can see what I was saying, the increase in the activity associated with non-ordinary states, how the psychedelics, how compared to the placebo situation, how dramatically increased the activity and the connectivity in the brain is. Then we did large study. We, about 35 years ago, started doing genetic studies because the classical manic depressive illness is typically clustering in the families. That's known for 100 years. And so we assumed that we're going to find some genes. And indeed, finally, after 35 years, last year, we found a set of 35 genes responsible for the lithium-responsive manic depressive illness. However, the interesting thing is we ended up having data from large families. There's a lot of Catholic families next to us in the Quebec side. And so over 35, 40 years, we have some families where we've seen 100, 110 people in the family, and 15, 20% of them had emotional problems. And all the people in the family who had emotional problems have indications that the neurobiological abnormalities are the same. They have the same type of clinical course. They have the same type of response to stabilizing treatments, same type of response to acute treatments, same time of adverse reactions, and so on. Yet, when you look at the family, this is one of the families, classical manic depressive, we start with the proband, examine everybody we know, so follow children, grandchildren, and you see that the problems, according to the DSM, is hugely variable. So the same abnormality in the brain, and yet the experiences, the non-ordinary states that they have, the panic, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorders, it's all over the place. And the same thing when we follow the children, they clearly have the same abnormality in the brain, but they start with sleep problems, then they have anxiety problems. By adolescence, they have some initial limited depressive episodes, and then later have full-blown illness. So this is completely you just cannot assume that these states are coming from the brain. And finally, when we studied the long-term courses, it turns out that what contributes, the brain contributes to the timing and the intensity of non-ordinary states, but not to the experience, not to the content. And I'm not going to take you through this. Essentially, this is like 4 years out of 40 years of follow-up of the activity in the brain. And it's these times that people are prone to non-ordinary states. And that if they experience some, they will be magnified. And I'm not going to go over the details. You can see this is like exponential oscillatory process. You can see that this lady had the episodes of depression and mania always at the peaks of the oscillatory process, except twice when she was pregnant. And we can also prove that when we treat people prospectively, it's not just a retrospective analysis. We treat now people episodically only when they have episodes of the peak of the activity in the brain. And when they do not follow the recommendations, this lady started traveling to Australia and lecturing and forgot to go back at the recommended time. They get sick again. So it's an active illness. But on the other hand, if we see that there is no peak coming, we keep them without medication for a year and a half without any problem. And the huge advantage is these people don't have any of the side effects that long-term treatments, of course, produce. So the conclusion is, the conclusion essentially is that I think our investigations are compatible very much with Stan's teaching and understanding of non-ordinary states. They are not local. They are somehow emerging from some other activity, not from the brain. Oh, this will be just the model. And this is what happens, that the oscillations just shoot above the ceiling for that particular person, and they are prone to non-ordinary states. So that would be the fastest possible summary. And maybe I should say just a few words. We also did, for a number of years, holotropic breath work with people with recurrent mood disorders and severe mood disorders. And I need to make it very clear that this was a special situation. This is not something one should do in a kind of weekend holotropic breathwork sessions. These people were in systematic psychotherapy and support and followed over periods of time. And
well, I think this is the only study where anybody was doing the holotropic breathwork with psychiatric patients, very, very difficult problems. Nobody has ever done that. Yeah.
But I had a trained team in holotropic breathwork. The people were ready to, if something opened and needed to be closed, we had a team that was ready to be with the person for up to 3 days in a private home. We had access to psychiatric bed, which we never needed for about 12, 13 years. And what was interesting, that the results is these people ranged from healing to just thinking much deeper insight into the nature of their suffering. And where the results were most valuable was in people who came and failed completely on mainstream psychiatric care. In other words, thinking about one of the ladies, she had like 12 years of psychoanalysis and cognitive therapy and different psychotherapies. She had 15 years of systematic psychopharmacology with all the available antidepressants. And in the third session of holotropic breath work, she broke through into a mystical experience. And over the years that I followed her afterwards, she was free of depressions until the family moved away, I think about 12 years later. It was very, very gratifying, and it was particularly helpful when the sources of suffering were very early in life. So, for example, in her case, it was during the first, she had traumatic experience with her mother during the first year of life, or when it related to birth, pregnancy, or past life experiences, because those are just not reachable by the traditional mainstream psychiatry. I've published these things. I'm not going to go over details and stop there.
It's great that in this study you have a video on that whole thing, which is amazing. Yeah, and you were doing it really outside of the research, yeah. And I think that they were not very happy about it.
Yeah, I had some problems.
It was unofficial, yeah.
Well, no, it was official, but we did it. We had a private house that the basement was converted for holotropic breath work. But certainly, when the hospital board found out about that, they were not particularly happy, because the way they learned about it, that I was doing body work with female patients in the basement, and so it just depends how things are communicated. Yeah. But fortunately, they saw me as a biological psychiatrist, so I was director of the hospital, so I survived.
I think it's just, I will say the last thing. When you were talking about mania and depression, this is really very interesting in holotropic breathwork and in psychedelics also, that the deep depression, isn't that what I call the second matrix?
Yeah.
Which is actually enormous energy in that, but it's all packed in,
Yes.
And actually the mania also this is part of the third matrix, but also have a lot of energy in it.
Yes.
So it's pretty much it's the same as you are talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unexpected.
The physiological chemical reaction are the same for mania and depression. Yeah.
Yes. But they are obviously
very much what we see in clinical, what we see in
But the biological changes are obviously concomitants of the non-nervous state. It's not the other way around. It's not caused by the biological.
It's very exciting that you are starting from a very different side and then sort of getting together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, very much for your presentation. It's an example that all roads lead to Rome.
Exactly.
So as we bring this session to a close, Jack, Maria, Paul, Brigitte, Stan, Susan, any closing comments or words that you want to share?
Listening to you, Paul, and Stan, and also to Maria and Mountain, I feel like the world is catching up, that medicine is beginning to open partly through the new research in psychedelics, but it's not just that. The inclusion of meditation and shamanism and the openness to the fact that consciousness is what needs to be changed, and not just a kind of, biological drug response or the much more limited vision of who we are as human beings, and that somehow this beautiful work from you, Stan, and all the things that you've opened up for us. The world is catching up and we really need it. So hallelujah and thank you.
The next few years are going to be very interesting, I think,
Oh,
the way it's shaping up.
Well, Paul, one thing I would like to say that maybe I haven't said it enough, that you are just a wonderful, wonderful brother.
Mhm.
All I
I'm
can
sort of I'm looking all around in some other families how they deal with their siblings and so on. You are just an ideal one.
Well, we've been very lucky, I think. Yes.
Very, very special. Yeah.
Well, I can't thank everybody enough for joining us today. This has been so wonderful. Paul, I have to say, when you're describing bringing breath work to people that are under psychiatric treatment, it reminds me of spiritual emergence. The idea that you're really willing to go deep into pain that has really derailed someone's life. And by staying in that process long enough, as Jack was saying earlier, as long as it takes, then these folks are able to access this deepest pain and move through it. I think that's incredibly encouraging.
Yes. Maria, any?
Well, and
final
also Susan and Jim, you know, you are just amazing for doing all this, creating it from these amazing reunions, you know. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for bringing us all together. It's wonderful.
We're waiting for your 100th, Stan. We've got 10 more years to go and then we'll have a bigger celebration.
We are working on it.
Yeah, what a celebration that will be.
Jim, you said at the beginning that you are creating something special, talking about the holotropic breathwork and so on the 90s. Should I know about it?
No, we cannot plan anything for the virus.
Yeah.
No, we cannot.
But you already have some idea.
We're in constant dialogue about it, but as Brigitte notes, it all depends on the world situation. We're all shape-shifting as we go through this pandemic. Humanity Rising itself wouldn't have never happened had it not been for the pandemic. And so we're celebrating your 90th in a very different way than we celebrated your 80th. And that's why I can hardly wait for your 100th. That'll be the celebration of all celebrations. Jack, and you and I and Maria, Paul and Susan, we should all be thinking about that 10 years down the road. But for now, the 90th is all we can handle. Well, thank you all.
I would like to add something, please. When you all speak and we see the life of Stan and that which we're celebrating and what he has brought into the world and he's brought together for mankind in that really selfless service and the knowledge he has brought back into the world, the remembrance of this spiritual knowledge and everything, seeing this all coming together with your stories and is wonderful to witness. And I just really want to add what you already have mentioned. Besides this fantastic knowledge that you have brought in the world, I think one of the biggest things besides your humor is your incredible love and heart. That's you are just the most loving person I've ever met.
My talent to find a wife.
So I thought I
Very
want to
special,
mention that in all your name probably. So.
And Maria, do we want to hear a final word from you?
Well, I think Brigitte just really said it. You know, Stan is a tremendous, a bottomless pool of acceptance and love.
And I think many, many people have bathed in that to their benefit. And I'm very grateful to be one of them.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a profound point, Stan, that, you know, you should just take in, you know, that, you know, if you think about all the gurus that have navigated through our lives over the last 50 years, the Bhagwans, the Muktanandas, the others that have met one scandal and crisis after another and risen and then fallen, Trungpa, etc. They've been a certain kind of leader. But I think you have personified a whole other level of leadership, which has really been, I think, as Jack pointed out earlier, you've been a mirror. You haven't attracted people to you as followers as much as you have been a mirror to people's potential and activated them to be who they are in an extraordinary plethora of creativity. So you had a life beyond reproach because you haven't succumbed to the, I would say, the snares of adulation that have really tripped up so many of the cult leaders and spiritual leaders that emerged out of the last part of the 20th century. You know, you think of the Tibetan Buddhists that tried to come to the West and just got seduced by the West rather than transform the West. So the leadership that you have provided to all of us, and the reason why I think people love you so deeply is because you've been a mirror of freedom. And that ultimately, I think, is the most refined leadership that there is for human beings to attain. I think that's just a powerful recognition of a life well lived. So I just want to thank you, and Brigitte, the way you've supported Stan over the years, and to feel the intense love that you share between the two of you and over these sessions. Susan, thank you for assembling such an array of lovers of Stan. And we're going to keep going, everyone. This is only March, but in April and May and June, we're going to assemble, again, people out of Stan's life that have been marked by his presence and have in and of themselves made tremendous contributions to the evolutionary consciousness of humankind at this critical moment in history, where nothing less than a radical change of consciousness at scale will suffice to save us from ourselves, basically, as the world careens out of control through climate change and a range of other crises unattended. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to be continuing the session tomorrow on Humanity Rising with the theme of what constitutes evolutionary intelligence. And we're going to Russia to a gentleman, Anatoly Balayev, who comes out of the transpersonal movement and the holotropic breathwork movement, who's written extensively on evolutionary intelligence. So we'll be spending time with Anatoly tomorrow. Same time, same station here on Humanity Rising. But thank you, everybody, on this panel today. Jack, Maria, Paul.
Thank you.
Brigitte, Susan, and Stan. Beautiful session. Thank you all.
Pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.